So, welcome everyone. Great to see you here tonight. We've got a great opportunity this evening to have a conversation with Ikari Jacob Wasserman, so you'll hear more about that shortly. But before we get there, we're going to start with Rabbi Ruth, who's going to share some reflections with us about this moment that we're in.
Hi, everybody. Oh, actually, I want to change my view here all of a sudden. So yeah, I want to see all of you. It's so nice to see you all. I'm really glad that you're all here. And it feels really powerful to me that we are meeting. I mean, this was scheduled in advance, of course, but that we're meeting when COP26 is just getting underway in Glasgow. And we're going to be bringing that in, our awareness, because why wouldn't we? So I want to start tonight with what I call a heaven and earth meditation, a few minutes of meditation practice to really help us connect with the earth and the heavens in our bodies, in our awareness. So I invite you to get comfortable where you're sitting, to just move a little bit so you can drop down a little bit from your active mind, into your body, and really notice your connection to the earth right now. Feet on the floor, the bottoms of your feet feeling that gentle pressure, and your buttocks on the chair, probably more pronounced pressure. Just notice those sensations, and let's be aware that this is, in fact, what we're feeling is our connection to the earth. And let's also feel the uplift in our body, the energetic uplift with the vertical. And bring our attention to our breath, just feeling physical sensations connected with your breathing effortlessly, just letting your breath come and go as it wants. All you're really doing by intention is bringing awareness to breath. And let's be aware of the full flow in and out. The breathing in, what that feels like, the breathing out and release. And with each breath, let's be aware of, again, the breath being effortless. And let's be aware of, on your next inhale, let's be aware of receiving the breath. The nurturing the nourishment really that comes with our breathing in. And the release with the out breath, the breathing out. See if you can invite even a softening in your chest area so that you can breathe in and out a little more deeply. And notice how many places in your body you can actually feel the flow of breath and that receiving and releasing. Just opening all the cells in your body maybe to receive breath. And let's be aware on our next breaths of doing the following: breathing in with the sense of breathing in from the earth on your next breath, taking that in, that energy, that nurturing, taking it into your body, and then on the out breath, releasing it into the heavens above and really all around you. The heavens, the shared space that in fact we're all occupying together. And then breathing in from the heavens, taking that in to your body, and on the out breath, releasing it down into the earth. On the in breath, taking it in from the earth, receiving in your body, releasing out into the heavens, and so on. We're going to continue for just a couple of minutes. I invite you to notice anything else that might come up. Notice, let it be, and come back to your breath and this beautiful opportunity together to open to our physical and spiritual connection to earth and heaven, to all that is, lives and breathes. We're part of it. And we can feel that interconnection, our interconnectedness in such a simple and deep and profound way. Let's take just a couple more breaths with renewed attention. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So I hope you feel some greater awareness of being connected to the earth and the heavens. And what I'd like us to do together now is to think about the fact that our president, our governor, our mayor, and so many world leaders are in Glasgow right now and are engaging in these potentially these incredibly important talks and potentially really life-changing decision-making that they're doing right now, potentially. The stakes are so high, and the chances of something really good coming out of it, I don't know what those chances are, but my guess is that if we allow ourselves to focus on it, it's something that, my guess is it's something we care about deeply, and we may be even afraid of letting ourselves care too much because we don't want to be disappointed. But what I'd like us to do together, what we'd like to do together is take a few minutes and really get in touch with what are our deepest hopes, yearnings, desires, our deepest desires for what gets done in Glasgow, what we'd like the leaders of the world to do, to decide, our president, other world leaders, and to create, to put each of us, for us to create together a kind of prayer kavanah that we want to offer the leaders who are gathered in Glasgow. And what we're going to do is simply focus our own thoughts, and then I'm going to ask you to write one line of what it is you'd like to ask, how you'd like to offer blessing. May you leaders of the nations and peoples of our world. I'll put the frame, but may you be blessed with, may you find your way to what your deepest hopes are for them, for what ends. I'm even reluctant I'll give an example, may you find the courage I want you to do it. I'm going to ask you to put one line and just limit yourself to one sentence in the chat, but not send it. We're going to just take a couple of minutes for everybody to do it, and I will tell you when you can send it. So we all send it into the chat at the same time, and then we'll offer together. We'll read it together, and this is something that I will send on your behalf. We'll send it to President Biden, and we'll send it to, if we can find a mechanism to send it more broadly, we'll do that. Okay, so let's take a few moments to gather our own thoughts and for each of us to put something in the chat. But wait, don't send it. You can write it, but don't send it till I let you know when that time is. Thank you. If you need another minute, can you raise your hand? Okay, let's send. Okay. So, to the leaders of the nations and peoples of the world, may you be blessed with the ability to feel the pain and deep hopes and yearnings for bold action on your part from peoples from all over the world. May you find the courage to meet these desires with the bold actions we need in order to protect the lives of our children and grandchildren and all future generations. May you find the courage to end carbon fuels. May you find the courage to make the hard and unpopular decisions. May you put the health of people and the planet before profit. May you all be guided by love and a sense of urgent stewardship for all life, current and future. May you remember the people you represent. May you find the way to save our planet for our children and grandchildren and many future generations. May we find the courage to act boldly on behalf of future generations, even at the price of current inconvenience and sacrifice. May you find your way to prioritizing sustainability over expediency. May you find the way to motivate us all to work and sacrifice for the sake of our children and their children, binding commitments to action beyond more promises, a vision for a future in which we consider the needs of the globe's entire population. May you imitate God, who listens to prayer, and hear that of the earth. Wow. May you be blessed with the courage and moral clarity to take immediate action for the sake of the earth. May you be bold, stand up to the coal industry and create financial incentives for sustainable energy. May you have strength and courage to make climate change goals to reduce environmental devastation. May you have the courage to help countries to change to sustainable energy that can't afford it on their own. The important change is achievable. Recognize the challenges for working people and have the courage to address the objections of the powerful. I think there were more somehow, but is that it? Am I missing any? These are beautiful. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear Ratzon?
Amen.
May the people gathered in Glasgow really feel the power of the prayers coming from all corners of the earth and of the earth itself. Thank you. So we're going to move on to prepare for some learning on public transportation and the current state of public transportation in our own area with Jacob Wasserman, learning a little bit some of the gleanings of the research he has been doing with others at UCLA. But before we do that, especially because we live in Los Angeles, and it may be that we don't take public transit regularly, all of us here, because this is not New York City after all, or Boston, or one of the cities that has amazing public transit, not yet. So we wanted to actually, we're going to move into small groups, into breakout groups in just a moment. But the question we want to spend a few minutes talking about is we want to invite us all to connect with a memory of when we use public transit on maybe even a regular basis, or maybe just a one-time thing. But when we use public transit and it was really important to us, it was really important to us. And why, to remind ourselves why and what the experience was and why it was so beneficial, so important, so helpful. So we're going to break into breakout rooms and get in touch with our own memories and share them with each other. And then we'll come back to the full group. Everybody, I hope this got you very motivated to hear what Jacob is going to be able to share with us about public transit here in Los Angeles.
Definitely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm looking forward to welcoming Jacob Wasserman. Jacob is a member of ICAR. and also a research project manager at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. And Jacob's going to talk with us some tonight about a couple of the issues that he researches, although if we're lucky, we'll get some time to talk with him about more things. But particularly this evening, our hope is to talk a little bit about what's happened to public transit during the pandemic period of time. We'll just kind of briefly talk about that. And then we wanted to talk with Jacob too about like what's in the near future for public transit in Los Angeles, and also a little bit about one of my favorite topics, parking, and the free parking, and what we can do, how that shapes our cities, and some ideas we might have about how to change things around. So Jacob, I just want to start by saying welcome. We're so grateful to have you here and sharing your expertise with us this evening, and really looking forward to having this conversation together.
Yeah, great to be here with everybody. I'm Jacob, he, him pronouns. Been going to ECAR for, I guess, about 3 years now. I'm Sophia's partner. Sometimes when she promises to make maps of things like oil wells, that's actually me. And
I'm grateful for that.
And my day job is I'm a researcher at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. So we have kind of a think tank at UCLA in the urban planning school that looks at the big issues in public transportation and mobility more broadly. Every time you fill up your gas tank, about half of 1% goes to research, which is not a lot to Sacramento, but means a lot to us. And we sort of help the legislature and the governor and regional and city governments in LA come up with sort of ideas and research on new transportation solutions. So sort of building off the little reflection we had in the breakout rooms, I just want to get some audience participation here at the beginning. My boss asked this at a presentation of his, so I'll do the same. What percentage of trips, so that's any time you leave from an origin to a destination, in the year 2017, the last year of the survey data before the pandemic, what share of trips were made by transit in America? Bus, rail, ferry, everything combined. Shout it out if you have some guesses.
Are we putting this in the chat?
Chat.
You can shout it out.
Shout it out.
More fun out loud.
Jacob, is this nationwide or in Los Angeles?
Nationwide. Any guesses?
1%.
20%. 20%.
I hear 20. I hear as low as 1.
5.
10.
Yes, 3%.
So 3% is pretty spot on. Brooke,
Whoa.
I think I need screen sharing.
Oh yeah, we can make that happen.
Yep, hang on one second, Jacob.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, 2.8%, so pretty good there in California, and about 2.3% nationwide of trips. So public transit sort of has a big place in our imagination, and certainly in the development of American cities. But can you all see this slide here? It is only in this little graph at the bottom about 2 or 3% of trips we make in America. And you can see that in California, and especially in the rest of the US, something like, over half, 60% of trips are driving alone, and then you add on another quarter that are carpooling. So just sort of to give some background, we live in a nation, a society that drives. Most of the trips are by driving. Most trips made by low-income people are by car. Most trips by people of color are by car. So I think that when we think about public transportation, the first lesson is that it is a very small, for now, share of trips, and that any conversation about public transit has to take place in the context of conversations about driving. And I'll talk about parking, as Brooke mentioned at the end. Just for some background here, this is public transit ridership since the past century. And you can see it was really heavy, especially on streetcars in the early 1900s, went down during the Depression and up again during World War II. But since then, there has been a pretty steady decline with a little bit of an increase in the past decade and a half, mostly on new rail systems. If you've seen Who Framed Roger Rabbit, there's, sort of a popular story about how this was a conspiracy. GM wanted everybody to drive, so they bought out the streetcars. There's a little bit of truth to that, but the broader story is that policymakers, governments built regions around the car. And LA actually had a pretty robust streetcar network, the largest number of miles of any city in the country. But it wasn't sort of the kind of transit that you think of today. It was private companies, often private electric companies, that wanted to sell their electricity, so they made electric streetcars, and real estate developers that made far-flung suburbs that originally were on the streetcars. And so all the staircases around Silver Lake, Los Feliz area, those were ways that you could get down from the hills to the streetcars on the main routes. And so those sort of became unprofitable because they were mainly real estate speculation, less than public transit. And so they largely were replaced by buses that went defunct, were bought out by cities. And then only in the 90s was there a renewed federal investment in public transit that has sort of led to the new rail systems that we have today in LA. And I'll talk about that a little in a second. But after the war, there was also subsidies for mortgages and housing, very restrictive covenants, so only white people could get them. But that moved people out to the suburbs in areas where public transit didn't serve well. So all these sort of policy decisions that the government made are the reason that today people drive, because we built our land and our housing and our jobs around the car instead of around public transit and walking and biking. So today we have this sort of asymmetry of who rides transit. So there is a core group of people in greater LA who ride, more than 45 times a month. That's predominantly lower income people, riders of color. And then there's about 20% who sometimes ride. Maybe they have one car for a 2-car household or something like that. But most Angelenos don't ride transit at all. And so transit ridership is sort of really concentrated in a small group of people who depend on it. And sort of when we were thinking about where we grew up and how transit served us, I think today the sort of 2 core functions of transit are first and foremost as a social service for those who lack other mobility options, whether due to economic necessity or physical disability, their license was taken away, other restrictions like that. Or transit's other big role is to get a lot of people from one same place to another same place where there's a concentration of destinations all together at the same time. So that means rush hours to downtown job centers. A little harder in LA because things are so spread out and there's multiple job centers. But that's why, transit serves rush hour fairly well and doesn't serve suburbs and weekends and off-peak times that well at all. And then the other kind of asymmetry is that there are very few areas where people take transit. So this was kind of a schema that divided up all of America into these 7 different neighborhood types that our institute came up with. But these old urban neighborhoods, which are sort of the dense cores of cities with maybe in LA sort of 5-story apartment buildings from before World War II, those neighborhoods make up just a huge share of transit trips. 14% of trips that are taken there are by transit versus very little in these other neighborhoods. But they really don't make up a lot of Los Angeles or a lot of the country. So with that in mind, we were kind of at our institute looking at public transit, and around 2015, transit ridership really started to fall. So this is California in blue and the US in yellow. And the reasons for this were really unclear. So in 2009, there was the recession, people were off work. It made sense that transit ridership was going down. But in the last half of the last decade, it was kind of a mystery. The economy was doing all right. Transit systems were pretty well funded. So one of my first research projects at my job was to kind of look at why this big decline in transit ridership was occurring. And here are two maps of LA. On the left is ridership gains between 2015 and 18, and on the right is losses. You can see the big gainer was the Expo line and then the gold line. It's a little deceptive though, because you can see that some of the crosstown bus lines from the west side to downtown lost a ton. So maybe a lot of that gain on the Expo line was from people shifting from buses to rail. And that's a benefit. Maybe you're going faster. But really, there's just these couple areas of gain where LA was investing in new rail systems. And then across the rest of the region, you saw losses. You saw them at peak times, at off-peak times, out in outlying areas. And this is just two systems, Metro and OCTA in Orange County. So this doesn't even show smaller systems that had losses as well. So we were trying to look at what might have caused this. The first thought maybe fares went up, but they didn't really go up more than inflation or more than past years. Maybe there'd been service cuts, and in DC where I'm from, there was sort of a spiral of service cuts and crashes that led to lower ridership, that led to less fares and then more service cuts. But that wasn't happening in California either. There's sales taxes that fund transit that we voted for in 2008 and 2016 here in LA. And so transit was well funded, putting more service out. So the real culprits that we kind of found were those areas outside of transit's control, housing and cars. And so I'll get to the second one. These graphs model what would happen if auto access had stayed the same. So that's if people had the same number of cars per household that they did in 2000 by the year 2015. And those are the light blue lines, and you can see transit held relatively steady. In the whole state, it would have even gone up if people had the same number of cars that they did. But in reality, the dark blue lines, it went way down in Los Angeles and down a fair bit in the state. And so what was happening was people started buying cars in the 2000s into 2015. There's a lot of reasons for this. Car loans increased and sort of moved into subprime car loans, which may have echoes of the mortgage crisis. A lot of it also came down to immigration. Immigration was way down, and new immigrants tend to have fewer cars and then get cars as they are in America for longer. And so with fewer new immigrants and more immigrants getting cars, that depressed transit ridership. And then broadly, there was sort of no attempt to make auto ownership pay for all the costs it imposes on society. And I'll talk a little bit about that in parking, but roads remained free. Gas, despite what you may pay at the pump these days, was relatively cheap for a lot of these years. And so people bought cars, and you can't blame them because, like I said, there is a lot of benefits to driving in a city in a region that was built around the car. The other big cause was high housing costs, which sort of pushed people farther from work. You can see more of a problem in the Bay Area, but still a problem in LA. As you move farther from work, transit gets less competitive with driving. And then even if you can take transit to work, let's say you live near Metrolink and you take it in from, Thousand Oaks or something like that to your job, you still may take transit for your commute, but now you live in an area where if you want to go to the grocery store, or you want to see a friend, or you want to go to a bar, driving or maybe Uber or Lyft are really your only options. And so as the housing crisis has pushed people farther and farther out, it's really hurt public transit as well. So that's kind of the not so great state of public transit right before the pandemic. And then this happened. Kind of made my work on falling transit ridership seem silly when there was a decline of about 80% within a week. And the pandemic, as you can see here, really did a number on transit. This graph is only updated to June. That spike, I believe, has kind of come down a bit for transit. So it's really only recovered to about half the ridership beforehand. And that's due to, legitimate fears about catching COVID in confined environments. Whereas driving and walking rebounded to more than their January 2020 demand by the summer of 2020. LA presents an interesting case because unlike the 5 years before the pandemic, when LA actually had some of the worst transit ridership declines in the nation, LA's transit actually stayed relatively well used, but that's not necessarily a good thing. The reason is that there are a lot of people in LA, especially essential workers, who are dependent on public transit. So LA's transit system had some service cuts, and so these essential workers were packed onto fewer and fewer buses that became more unreliable, but that was their only means of getting around. And it sort of proved the necessity of public transit, even if it's serving a small portion of the population. It's what allowed people to get to grocery stores and serve essential jobs and provide mobility for those who don't have it. So transit kind of proved its worth then, but it's still struggling. And during this time, a lot of systems, including LA Metro, went fare free or effectively fare free. And I can talk a little bit about that in Q&A and the chances that it goes permanently fare free. So I'll talk a little bit now before questions about the other topic that's near and dear to my heart and Brooks too, is parking. So I mentioned sort of how we built cities around the car and what effect that has on public transit. A big part of that is parking. And this book here, The High Cost of Free Parking by Professor Donald Shoup. I'm a fan of prop comedy, I guess. Have my book with me. I'll try to sum it up very quickly, though. You should Google Don Shoup. He teaches at UCLA. He calls himself the Shoup Dog and has a Facebook group where he posts memes about parking. He's the kind of the world expert in parking, and his book in a nutshell talks about how parking is free to use almost everywhere, but its costs are passed on to all of us. And so what I mean by that is your car sits idle 95% of the time. And that land in LA is very valuable. You look at your rent or your mortgage and you know how valuable land is in LA. And yet the cheapest way to get land is to call it a parking space, and then it instantly becomes free. And so the way that kind of happened was along with the sort of shifts in population after the war, there was in many cities, including LA, the start of minimum parking requirements. So what these are when you build a new building, the city says you have to build a certain number of parking spaces. And there are all sorts of ridiculous requirements for them. For housing, it's usually based on the number of bedrooms, is the number of spaces, but sometimes for hairdressers, it can be based on the number of barbers they have, the number of lanes in a swimming pool. Again, Professor Shoup has a whole catalog of the different ridiculous requirements. And let me share here. One of the most ridiculous. Here we go. And here, oops. So this is a graph by the Institute of Transportation Engineers showing how they calculate parking requirements. And so they'll take surveys, usually in way out in the suburbs, oftentimes on, you know, days where there's a lot of demand, like Black Friday or something like that. And they'll say, okay, how big was the store and how many people came to it by car and left by car? And then they'll kind of try to fit it and say, okay, this store needs this much parking. But you can see from this graph that they kind of assume that bigger stores mean more parking, bigger housing developments mean more parking, when in reality on this graph, they based it on 2 surveys and then drew the line the wrong way. So us urban planners have kind of not done these requirements based on data. They haven't done them based on sort of looking at what actual parking needs there are. And as a result, this is a map of, if you took all the parking in LA, on-street and off-street parking, and put it together, it would be 200 square miles. And so we build all this parking, and it costs about somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000 a space, more if you're building underground. And that cost has to go somewhere, and it usually goes into rent and the cost of goods and services. And so when an apartment builds 2 or 3 parking spaces plus guest parking spaces, they have to raise rents in order to cover that. And so that exacerbates the housing crisis. And there's sort of, that's not to say that if parking requirements went away, that developers still wouldn't build parking. They would. People still have cars and they'd still use them. But parking requirements set parking at a high level for everybody, even if you wanted to have some units in a building, or especially a, you know, homeless supportive housing project where you might have a few spaces, but probably far less, because there's far fewer people with cars who would prefer lower rent to a parking space. But that option just isn't available because everywhere has to have these ridiculous parking requirements that are set through those kind of pseudoscientific graphs. I'll close sort of with the other facet of this, which is the high cost of free parking. So parking, we build into every new building in LA. Every old building still has parking unless you go back to buildings built before then, and then you get these wonderful little bungalow courts and walkable shopping districts. And you can see why parking sort of moves stores to the back of a strip mall parking lot instead of right up against the sidewalk. So it makes it less safe, less walkable. But all that parking is free to use. And the analogy that one of the other professors at UCLA, Mike Manville, likes to compare to is water use. In California, we have lots of droughts. And if water were free for everybody, then we would use too much of it. We would, you know, overwater our lawns, not that we don't already, just let our sink run all the time. And the same is true for parking. There's benefits to parking, but if it's free, people will overuse it. It's kind of a commons problem like that. And when people overuse it, the costs are not only shifted onto rent and the cost of things you buy at the store, but it's also shifted onto time. So the frustration you feel when you circle the block 5 times because you can't find a parking space is because the parking is free. And if it was priced in a way that was set not to make a profit for the city or for whoever owns the parking lot, but priced in a way like water systems in California that by law have to be priced just to cover the costs. You could do something similar for parking where you set the rate such that basically anytime you went, there'd be 1 or 2 open spaces. And there's a lot of concerns about what you do with the money, how you help low-income drivers. And again, this book talks a lot about that. But we do it with electricity and water. We have low-income discounts. We have programs that, you know, help people who need water, and we don't shut off power during the winter or whatnot. And so these are solvable problems. But there's sort of, because it's built into every building, there's this sense that everybody is entitled to their parking spot for free at every location they go to. And then that makes people want to buy cars, and it furthers the cycle. The hopeful notes is that there are proposals at the state legislature to try to fix this. There was a bill last term, Assembly Bill 1401 by Laura Friedman, who represents Glendale and Los Feliz and Burbank, which would have gotten rid of parking requirements around transit. Again, not forcing people not to build parking, but not mandating the parking. That unfortunately was killed by Senator Portantino of La Cañada, but it might come back next year. And then I learned at the Minyan Tzedek meeting that ICAR is working on a proposal to lower or get rid of parking requirements when a hypothetical synagogue wants to add supportive housing in their new building. And the cost of that would be passed on to either the new residents or all of us when it's not necessarily needed. And so there's action to try to change this. And I sort of don't need to say how this all ties into climate and the huge climate cost of driving, which is 40% of emissions in California these days. So I'll close there. Happy to take any questions about my research, what I presented, such like that.
Jacob, thank you so much. First of all, I just learned so much in that presentation. Really grateful for the overview. I want to start out with a few questions, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes for others to chime in. So, can you speak specifically? One thing we didn't get to yet was the free fare system, and whether that's like. Can you explain briefly, first of all, like what version of fare free we have right now? And then what would be the sort of positive benefits of going to a completely fare-free system? And then maybe if you can, a little bit about like how likely do you think it is that might happen on Metro?
Yeah, so a lot of operators went fare-free during the pandemic because of concerns that you pay up at the front of the bus by the driver, and so the close contact might spread COVID. LA Metro kind of did this thing where they didn't pick a side. They still technically said there's a fare on the books, but they're not going to enforce it. They're not going to ask for it, which kind of created a lot of confusion. But until January 1st, if you don't know, all Metro buses are free. You do not need to tap. You can just get on. And there are systems that are going fare-free permanently. Albuquerque's actually, starting in 2022, is going to be totally fare-free. And I see a lot of benefits to that. For one, there's a cost to collecting fares. There's fare enforcement, but there's also those fare boxes cost a lot. Smart cards cost a lot. Shipping money around, you need an armored car. And there are smaller transit systems, not LA's, but where the cost of collecting fares just isn't worth it. But even when it is, the other costs of fares are often around the issue of enforcement. So there was a study that, at least in Long Beach, I think, over half of citations for fare evasion went to Black riders, and they are not half of the ridership. It leads to confrontations, especially with unhoused riders, and I did some research on that I can talk about later. And so the cost of transit, it's not negligible. It's also not a ton. It's $175 for a ride and cheaper if you have a monthly pass, but it can be a barrier for some people. But it really becomes a barrier when it gets tied up in the criminal justice system and the system of policing. And LA Metro has contracts with 3 different policing agencies. And so fare free would eliminate a lot of those potential sources of conflict. And then also free transit is faster. You don't have to wait as everybody taps on at the front of the bus. The big question is how to pay for it. Fares only cover in LA about 25 to 30% of operating costs, and that's not even counting the cost of building the new rail system. But just the cost of running the system day to day, about a quarter come from fares. So that's not that high, but it's not nothing. And so there is a question, and it's a legitimate one, where that money is going to come from. Is it going to come from the feds? Is it going to come from another sales tax? Is it going to come from maybe some sort of tolling system for our major interstates? I don't know the right answer there, but transit does still need to stay in business. So that's kind of the big question for fare free transit.
Is there any research on whether or not, or to what extent, going fare free increases ridership?
It does a lot, yeah. The systems that have done it have seen huge spikes. I just saw a graph the other day of ridership during COVID when Atlanta restarted their fares. Right before, I think it was a couple months ago, they were actually just about at pre-COVID numbers, and then they restarted fares and it dropped like by 20 points or something like that. The first sales tax LA passed to fund transit, part of it funded not free but reduced fares on buses for 4 years, and you can see in a graph ridership for those 4 years was much higher. It's partially that people who depend on it and are very low income, that cost can mean a lot, but it's also partially for free transit. Just psychologically, you don't have to think about having a tap card on and making sure it has money in it, because we can't pay by credit cards on directly on most transit systems in the US. If you're somewhere and you have to take a detour, you don't have to worry about paying a fare twice because you have to get off the bus and get on another one. So there's all sorts of reasons that it leads to higher ridership. Yeah.
Thank you. And this, can you speak to about, so right now on Metro, it's true that buses, they're not collecting fares until January, but then there's this pilot program going on right now. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of briefly explain what that is? And if you can, talk a little bit about the possibility of, one, extending that, or two, going to a truly fare-free system more permanently? Yeah.
So I think right after January, fares are going to be half off for a month for everybody. But the big news that came out of the Metro board recently was they have a pilot for students, all students 18 and under, and then I think community college students. I'm not sure exactly what colleges are eligible, where you can get free fares through your schools. And there's a lot, I've heard a lot of the rollout started a couple weeks ago. It's apparently been kind of rocky. Some students actually had tap cards through their schools anyway, but they have to get new tap cards that were free. But all which is to say, when it actually works, it's a really good idea, because California actually spends far less on school buses than most other states. Not exactly sure the reasons for that, but in major cities in California, students take transit to school. And so making it free, especially pre-driver's license years, really will help the mobility of students who are old enough to travel on their own, and then also kind of build a sense of transit ridership. Because if you don't start riding transit, I mean, it's like riding a bike. You don't know how to do it. You don't know where to get a tap card. Maybe you do feel unsafe. But if you get started when you're young and you're going with a group of your fellow students, and it feels part of your regular life, it can build those lifelong habits.
Yeah. As a parent, I can attest to the truth of everything you just said. I have 3 teenagers who have all done a lot of riding transit in LA, and it's been really a good and liberating thing for them, and taught them a lot of independence, and allowed them a lot of mobility around the city long before they had driver's licenses. And it really, I think, helped us delay them getting driver's licenses, which also, as a parent, is a thing I was very happy about. But I will also add that it's also led to one of my kids at least having multiple interactions with police over fare enforcement. And even as young as 11, 12 years old, getting busted by the cops for missing a fare is kind of a scary experience, and certainly something that will also put you off transit ridership too. So I just felt compelled to share a little bit of my own personal experience with kids in transit. So can you, and I should wrap us up quickly. So I'll just put in a plug here and say, our Green Action Team is very interested in helping to secure free transit for LA Metro going forward. And so there is this pilot program underway right now that Jacob spoke about, but there will certainly be opportunities in the near future for us to do advocacy work on behalf of a permanent and fully fair free transit system, rather than this sort of wonky and weird system where it's like it's free for students, but you have to apply, and it's free for people who are low income, but they have to apply, and it's means tested and it's complicated. And so we really have a sort of North Star of real fair free transit, and want to be a part of coalitions that are advocating for that. So please keep an eye, folks, for opportunities to do that advocacy with us. And Jacob, I'm sure we will call on you in the future to come and speak with us more about the nitty-gritty of all that too. I want to take 2 minutes then and just speak about the parking thing, because you mentioned also that. So one of the reasons I've gotten nerdy about parking, and I'm very interested in parking minimums and parking requirements, as many of you have heard, is that ECAR is intending to build some permanent supportive housing on our new site. And we've discovered that there was a state law passed a year and a half ago that allows faith communities to remove up to 50% of their required parking, but only existing parking spaces if they're going to build affordable housing on their sites. And we have found that the amount of parking that the city would require us to build for the ECAR building, not for the housing, but just for ECAR, is significantly more than we want to build. And that parking, because it will all have to be built as underground parking, will probably cost about $75,000 a space, roughly. And we would like to build less than that, less than what they're asking us to. So we are in the process right now of trying to find a lawmaker who will take up this problem and help introduce a new law in the legislature this session that will essentially allow that existing law to apply to new faith communities that are building affordable housing at the same time that they're building their own faith communities for themselves. So one, that would be a great thing for us as ECAR, but also we really believe that it will be a good thing for the wider community, for trying to get more housing built, and for building less free parking in cities where there are other good options for people, and where we want to, as Jacob said, we want to like stop externalizing the cost of free parking onto communities and institutions, and ask people to really like take some consideration for the true cost of their own parking, and encourage our community to drive less. So you will be hearing more about that from us in the near future as well. I'm going to stop there and invite others who may have burning questions to ask to raise a hand right now and let us know if there's something you want to ask, and we'll take just a few minutes for that. Ruth, I see your hand. Just go ahead and mute.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Jacob, if there have been any studies measuring, computing the climate impact of increased ridership that comes with the fare free systems.
Unfortunately, none that I know of, because they're relatively rare in the US. I think Albuquerque's starting, maybe Eugene, Oregon, somewhere in Oregon has one. But they're relatively rare. I will say I read a study a few years ago that says that you need about 4 to 8 people on a bus, depending on how it's powered, for it to net out as less emissions than driving, which in LA is not always the case. Sometimes these buses are running with fewer people than that, especially when they're serving sort of more outlying areas. So fare free transit, if it can get that number on that bus, up above that threshold, and as buses electrify, which is happening too, that can provide a huge climate benefit.
Lisa, was that a hand or were you clapping?
Yes, thank you very much, Jacob. I wonder if I could impose on you to talk a little bit about what role frequency seems to play in terms of bus usage, because to my mind, the #1 reason not to take a bus is that if you have to get somewhere at a time certain, you cannot bet on it.
Yeah, that is a huge one, and it is particularly true outside of rush hours. I mean, these schedules seemed like they were designed, or in many cases were, when everybody, the man of the household got up to his 9 to 5, and that was the only time you'd leave, the house. But that's not the case with gig work, with night shifts, and again, think about the people who ride transit. But schedules have not adapted, and generally service, despite the fact that it did increase in the years leading up to the pandemic, is still really low. And so there's a transit planner, Jared Walker, who said that frequency is freedom. And when you have buses that run and trains that run every 10 minutes or less, you don't need to look at the schedule. I mean, when you take the subway in New York, you don't check the schedule, you just go and you'll get a train. And there are parts of Europe and Asia and South America where they do that for their commuter rails. Usually big trains that you think of coming every hour, like Metrolink or Metro North in the New York area, but there you just kind of get there and you get on the train. And so studies have looked at the fact that fare-free transit is important, but actually more important to riding is reliable transit and frequent transit.
Yeah.
And so that's partly just funding and putting out more service, and then it's partly giving buses space on the road. And so the sort of biggest, though not that hard, it requires a row of cones, improvement is bus-only lanes, transit-only lanes. And LA did pilot a number of those during the pandemic. There's a great video, if I can find it afterwards, of sort of a count of how many, not vehicles, but how many people are using a stretch of street with a pilot bus lane during the pandemic. And it's sort of like you see 3 cars going by and then a bus goes by, and that's 60 people. So it kind of looks, especially if you're driving yourself, like the bus lane is empty, but actually every time a bus goes by, that's 60 people. And so there's sort of starting to be a shift, and I hope it continues more, that we plan around people movement, not vehicle movement. And so those kind of improvements are where frequency can also be helped as well.
I'm going to take this one last question here. Sorry, if I could I'm going to get this one last question from Stefan, which is a good follow-up on that. And then we've got a few other things to do. So Stefan's asking in the chat here, everyone, including poor people, need transit to be reliable. Do you think that free transit, it would be better off to spend the money that we're spending on free transit, to spend that money instead on improving frequency and service? Or have there been studies on that?
Yeah, there's one answer and another answer. One answer is, if I could only spend the money on one thing, it would probably be more reliable, more frequent transit, because the fare is a burden, but it's cheaper than gas most of the time. And frequent transit really is what makes it able to be a feasible alternative to get to a job on time and not be late and get fired and not be stranded somewhere at night. That said, it is dangerous in all sorts of policy areas to think of these things as zero sum. And there's, a whole political discussion that, we talk about in e-car all sorts of ways, but there's money to fund things like transit and housing, and it's out there, and we just have to have the will to do it, and to, put our money where our mouth is, and put our road space also where our mouth is. And so you can have free and reliable transit. It really isn't out of the realm of possibility. If you go to Europe, you go to major cities in South America or China, they make it work. So yeah, I'll close there just with one note for you, Brooke. I think Laura Friedman would be a good person to talk to on the bill, but I will also say that these aren't state laws that make it so that you have to build parking. They're all city laws. And the state law that allowed existing parking at religious institutions to be converted only had to happen because the state had to force cities and override their rules because they didn't want to do it. So state law might be the politically easiest way, but the blame kind of lies at the city of LA, and then the state would step in and really have to be the heavy, because the city isn't the one that's moving.
Yeah, super interesting conversation to be had. And the answer is, having pursued this a little bit, I think that is in fact exactly why we need to go to the state. Because I think we could get it done there, even though the state is a much bigger unit of government. It's where I think we can get it done. And of course, it also does good for 40 million people instead of just our 4. So, so there's that too. So Jacob, I just thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. I'm sure we all learned a lot. I certainly have. And we look forward to relying on you for future discussions of all things transportation. Before we let you all go, and I know it's getting late, there's a couple of things that we wanted to do. So Sophia, I'm going to ask you to quickly take it from here and do a little bit of policy updating, and stick with us, folks. I promise it'll be worth your time. Jacob, thank you so much.
Yeah, this will be really, really fast. So first, there's only been one day of COP26, but a few good things that happened was that India promised net zero emissions by 2070, which they hadn't previously. And also 100 countries promised to halt and reverse forest degradation by 2030, which is also a big deal. And also a bunch of people made speeches. So hopefully better things will happen in the next few days. So that's what's happening there. And then there was big news from CalGEM, which is the California Geologic Energy. Wait, can you hear me now? Okay, wait, did you hear about CalGEM, or when did I mute?
Say it again.
Oh, okay, so big news from CalGEM, which is the California Geologic Energy Management Agency, which announced that there's going to be a buffer zone of 3,200 feet, which is 0.61 miles. And by the way, we were advocating for 2,500 feet, so this is more than that, so that's good. And that's from homes, schools, hospitals, and detention centers. So what's happening with that is it's just a draft rule. And now there's going to be public comment on the draft rule for 60 days. And then CalGEM has to do an in-depth economic analysis of the rule. And then they'll submit the proposed rule to another office. And then they'll get more comments. So that sounds like a lot of steps, but it's also a really big deal. And really the result of a lot of advocacy from groups like ours, and also Stand LA especially, and Vision. So that's a really big deal. And then if we have like 10 more minutes, so we keep making calls about federal bills because they keep not being passed, which indicates how important it is that we keep reminding our senators that we still want bills. So if you were here last month, oh, okay, yeah. So if you were here last month, you know how to do this. But I'll just put it in the chat, and then afterwards, everyone just fill out the information, and then it'll call your phone and then go to your representatives, and it's really easy. So yeah, if after this call you want to do that, it's very, very easy, and also very important, so that hopefully next month when we meet, we will not have to do this again. We're really, really hoping for that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sophia. And then will you also pop in the chat the CalGEM call to action? All right, so while Sophia does that, I am going to hand it over to, Elise, am I handing it to you or to Pesach now? I'm handing it to Pesach.
I will take it. Thanks, Brooke. Good evening, y'all. So I am going to share with you about an upcoming event that I am really excited about. On Tuesday, November 16th, the Los Angeles Faith and Ecology Network, of which I and Ikar have been a part for over a year now, along with Temple Isaiah, will be hosting a Zoom meeting with 3 power players who will be discussing their environmental priorities. We'll be speaking with State Senator Sidney Kamlager, Katie Young Yaroslavsky, who has represented County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl around the environment, and Andy Schrader, who's City Council District 5 Director of Environmental Affairs. Oh, there's 4 actually. Fran Pavley as well, former elected official. The event will be at 7 p.m. Tuesday, November 16th. We'll be following up with more information and a link to register. It's on Zoom, and it's an opportunity to organize. So we're all really working on getting a good turnout, and having an ICAR contingent there will be critical. So I'll hope to see you all there.
Thank you, Pesach. And Elisa.
Okay, how's that better?
You got it, you got it.
Well, okay. Yes, in addition to that, I'm just going to kind of review the actions that are going to go out and that we are encouraging everyone to do. We're still keeping up the pressure on Senator Dianne Feinstein, because what we want is we want environmental justice that saves the planet without hurting workers and marginalized communities. We're going to give you a chance to view the statement of our ally Chazan, coming straight from COP26 all the way over in Glasgow. And so you can take a look at their wording of the Jewish response to climate change and see how our tradition helps us partner with God in protecting the creation. Rabbi Ruth is going to be sending our collective prayer to President Biden and other world leaders. You are welcome to do the same, and I'll have the email address for you there. Pesach told us about the Zoom thing that's coming up with Laughlin and with Temple Isaiah. And so there really are plenty of things that you will see for us to do. And I completely am thrilled that we had Jacob kind of bring us up to speed on everything that's going on and not going on in transit and where we can take it from there. So thank you everybody for coming and contributing.
So if you're able, I was a little concerned about the time, everyone, but if you're able and you're willing, if you want to stay on for 5 more minutes and make your call to Dayenu, we can do it all together and see each other's smiling faces and know that we got the thing done. And then we'll wave goodbye. And if you got to go, I totally understand. We love you anyway. Make your phone call and we will see you next month. All right.
Good.
Okay. Yes. So Ruth, whoops, where'd you go? Okay. So if you want to make your call right now to Dayenu, you go to that the link that Sophia posted, this dayenu.org/call, and make the call from your phone. Are people still on the phone? Looks like Ruth is still on the phone. Sophia, are you off? You're done? Jack, you're done? Thank you all.